Everybody's hurt. Well, you know Dre gonna be there. Dre gonna hoop.
Right.
Dre gonna get us some assists. He gonna help us get some points. We gonna lose, but somebody gonna make ESPN.
Steady, consistent, and predictable. Andre Miller was never going to be the most exciting player on the court, but you knew what you were going to get from him, and it was always going to be more good than bad. From a player whose basketball IQ was through the roof, Miller's game was played low to the ground, relying on crafty up fakes, a great post game, and a proficiency in the mid-range to get his points. But it wasn't his points he was worried about, it was his teammates. As one of the most unselfish players and most underrated passers of all time, and when he was in his younger years, he was a great defender as well. He built his reputation as a key member of the Utah Utes in the late 90s, leading them all the way to the NCAA Championship game as a junior. Entering the '99 NBA draft as a complete point guard prospect. His early years were spent on bad teams, but once he got to a better situation in Denver, the professor showed that he could be added to any winning formula, rarely missing the playoffs over the remainder of his career. He doesn't have many eye-popping individual seasons, but it was his consistency for over 15 years that made him so valuable. But it may also be why he slipped through the cracks, never making an all-star team in his 17-year career. A career that saw him leave the NBA as one of very few players to record over 8,500 assists. And while it may be easy to take his play for granted, you can guarantee Andre Miller will never be forgotten by his teammates. Let's jog your memory. An LA native, Andre Miller would go through a noticeable change in his childhood after the passing of his brother Dwayne due to encephalitis, as Miller would say after losing his brother that he had to grow up quickly. Miller's mother Andrea emphasized academics, and Miller would always be enrolled in private schools to maximize his education, and this stayed the same once he got to high school, enrolling at Verbum Dei, a private school in Watts. But during these years, basketball was never the priority in the Miller household, as Andre would often arrive late for practice due to finishing up yard work. Even when he was promoted to varsity as a sophomore, he couldn't celebrate long, after his mother came looking for him to complete some more yard work. But this isn't to say that his mother didn't support her son, as she was always at his games. And by his senior year, he was one of the top high school players in the state, averaging 24 points and 7 rebounds, en route to being named CIF 4A Player of the Year. But everything unraveled quickly. Even with his mother's emphasis on academics, Miller's grades were low, and his ACT score was below the NCAA's Prop 48 requirements. And according to Miller on the Knuckleheads podcast, schools stopped recruiting him because of this. But luckily, Miller had played for the Los Angeles Rockfish club team, and through his play, he had been noticed by Verbum Dei alumni Donnie Daniels, who was also an assistant coach at the University of Utah. And he was a fan of Andre's game, so he was able to convince Coach Rick Majerus to offer Miller a scholarship, even though he would be ineligible for the '95 season. But Miller buckled down and was suiting up for the Utes come '96. Utah was coming off a 28-6 season and a tournament appearance, and the main reason for that can be summed up in 3 words: Keith Van Horn. The now junior had been one of the nation's best players since arriving at Utah 2 years ago, but something they were missing was a great point guard to get him the ball, and that's exactly what Miller was. Miller would become Utah's starting point guard, playing in every game and finishing first on the team in assists and second in steals, while shooting over 53% from the field. Miller was a low-maintenance, unselfish guard who loved getting his teammates involved first, and he was a great defender on the other end. And with the addition of Miller, the Utes put together another great season. Utah would start the season 9-3 before rattling off 10 straight wins, and overall finishing the year at 23-5 and ranked in the top 10. They began the WAC tournament strongly with a big win over Hawaii, followed by a close defeat of Colorado State. But they came up short after losing to New Mexico in the championship game. Yet they would still receive a tournament bid and run through Canisius in the first round, with Miller putting up 10 points, 7 rebounds, 4 assists, and 3 steals. Round 2 would bring Iowa State, and this would be a much tougher game for Utah. It was close all game, and the teams were tied at the half, and Miller was having a great game, but late in the second half, he would come down hard and have to leave the game. But this was one of the first examples of Miller's toughness and durability, as he would return to the game and hit a clutch 3 to put Utah ahead by 5, then hit 2 free throws with less than 30 seconds left to help ice the game for the Utes, as he finished with 14 points, 7 assists, 2 steals, and 2 blocks. And Utah was on to the Sweet 16 to take on Kentucky, but a stacked Wildcats team dismantled Utah, And although Miller dished a game-high 9 assists, he also had just 2 points and 6 turnovers. But his freshman year wrapped up with him averaging about 8.5 points, 4.5 assists, and 1 steal per game. With a senior Van Horn and a junior Michael Doliak, this looked like Utah's best chance to have some real success. And Miller did an even better job as the team's floor general. Once again, scoring was not his main responsibility, yet he would finish top 3 on the team. But his 6.1 assists per game would lead the team and be a career high, as well as a top 3 mark in the conference. And this year, he would lead the team in steals by a large margin, en route to being named to the WAC All-Defensive Team. Utah began the season ranked in the top 5, but would lose to Arizona and Wake Forest within their first 10 games. But then, over their final 16 games, they would lose just one more time, which would be to New Mexico on February 1st, a loss they would avenge in the final game of the regular season when they blew out the Lobos by 20, as the 23-3 Utes were entering the conference tourney on an 8-game win streak, a streak which was tested early and often. The quarterfinal brought SMU, and this game went down to the wire, but with time winding down, Van Horn would tip in a Miller inbounds pass at the buzzer to give Utah a 1-point win. The semifinal brought New Mexico and another close game, but Van Horn made magic twice, as after Miller attempted a fading jumper to win the game, Van Horn was able to get the rebound and drain the putback at the buzzer, giving Utah another win and a date with TCU in the WAC Tournament Championship. And this time, they won convincingly to take home the championship and punch their ticket to the big dance. Round 1 brought Navy, who Utah would defeat pretty easily, as Miller finished with 12 points, 5 rebounds, and 6 assists on over 71% shooting. The second round brought UNC Charlotte, who would also fall to the Utes, as although Miller had just 8 points, he added 9 assists, 5 rebounds, and 2 steals. The Sweet 16 would be a much tougher test versus Stanford, and while Miller had his best scoring game of the tournament with 19 points on 7 of 11 shooting, it was also a game he'd like to forget. Utah would jump out to a double-digit halftime lead, but would give it up in the second half, as the Cardinal forced overtime, but they would eventually lose to Utah by 5. However, a big reason for Stanford's comeback was Miller's struggles to take care of the ball, as he finished with 11 turnovers. But the Utes got out alive and were set for a rematch with Kentucky in the Elite 8. But once again, they just couldn't get past a deep Wildcats team. Miller would have a respectable 11 points and 5 assists, but Kentucky was too much, winning by 13, as Miller's sophomore season had ended with him averaging about 10 points, 4.5 rebounds, and 6 assists per game. Van Horn was gone in 98, so Miller would have to take on a much larger offensive role, and he would, as he upped his scoring by over 4 points per game to finish second on the team, while still acting as the team's top distributor, and would finish top 5 in the conference in steals per game, as he would again be named to the WAC All-Defensive Team, as well as be voted first team All-WAC. Everyone expected Utah to take a step back after the loss of Van Horn, but instead, they would be 4th in the nation in points allowed, and would come out of the gate flaming hot, winning their first 18 games of the season, which included a defeat of a ranked Wake Forest team. New Mexico would hand them their first loss in early February, and they would lose one more to Wyoming a couple weeks later. But overall, they ended their regular season with a 25-2 record, and ranked number 5 in the nation. The Utes looked like a lock to at least get to the conference championship game. Yet instead, they would shockingly lose to UNLV in the quarterfinal, as they couldn't make a shot from anywhere. They would get a bid to the NCAA tournament, but after their WAC tourney performance, not a lot of people had them going too far. Round 1 brought San Francisco, and Miller would put up a modest 8 points, 6 rebounds, and 3 assists, as Utah won easily, setting up a second-round matchup with Arkansas. This game would be much closer, but the Utes were able to get the win behind Miller's game-high 28 points on 9 of 14 from the field and 10 of 13 from the free throw line, along with 7 rebounds. Next up was West Virginia in the Sweet 16, and again, Utah would cut it close, but they would still get the win as Miller finished with 14 points, 8 assists, and 3 steals. And now, Utah had to get through the defending national champion Arizona Wildcats, but they would with ease. The Utes would hold the Wildcats to below 29% shooting, while they would shoot nearly 53%, and Miller would lead the way, as his 18-point, 14-rebound, 13-assist triple-double would be the 4th recorded triple-double in tournament history at the time, and lead Utah to a 15-point win and a trip to the Final Four to take on North Carolina. Although Miller didn't record another triple-double, he got close, finishing with 16 points, 14 rebounds, and 7 assists, as Utah would outlast UNC and had just one more team to get through, but it was Kentucky, who had knocked them out of the tournament the past 2 years. And unfortunately, the Wildcats would extend that to 3 years. Miller finished with 16, 6, and 5, but would also commit 8 turnovers and eventually foul out. And even though Utah had a 10-point lead at halftime, Kentucky would outscore them by 19 in the second half to win the title, with Miller's junior season seeing him average about 14 points, 5 assists, and 2 steals per game. Utah would have high hopes going into 99, but they wouldn't really be able to reach them. For the second straight season, they lost their top scorer, this time in Doliak, but they had 2 good junior forwards in Hanno Motola and Alex Jensen, and the senior Miller would again up his scoring to lead the team, while still leading the team in assists and steals, and finishing top 5 in the conference in both those categories. For the third straight season, Miller would be named to the WAC All-Defensive Team, and for the second straight season, he would be first team All-WAC. But now Miller was a top player in college basketball, as on top of being named WAC Player of the Year, he would also be a consensus first-team All-American. Utah continued as a top 5 defense, but didn't look good to begin the 99 season, as after 9 games they were 5-4. But just when you thought you could count them out, the Utes would run the table, winning their final 19 games to end the regular season with a 24-4 record and a number 12 ranking in the nation. And this year's conference tourney would go much better, as they would easily defeat BYU in the quarterfinal and then outlast Tulsa in overtime in the semifinal to set up a matchup with New Mexico for the championship. And they would hold the Lobos to 45 points to win the conference tourney, as they were again heading back to the NCAA tournament. Round 1 brought Arkansas State, and after a close first half, Utah would dominate the second half en route to a 22-point win, which saw Miller finish with 8 points, 4 assists, and 4 steals. And after last season's run, no one was going to count out Utah again. But then just like that, their season was over, as even though Miller had 20 points, 6 rebounds, and 3 steals against Miami of Ohio in round 2, Utah couldn't withstand a great second half from the Redhawks, led by Wally Szczerbiak, as their year would come to an end, with Miller's senior season seeing him average about 16 points, 5.5 assists, and 2.5 steals per game. So Miller's college career was over, as not only was he leaving Utah as their career leader in steals and second in program history for career assists, but he was also leaving as a college graduate, obtaining a sociology degree. Yet he wouldn't be needing that degree anytime soon, as he was one of the top point guard prospects in the 1999 NBA draft.
With the 8th pick in the 1999 NBA draft, the Cleveland Cavaliers select Andre Miller from the University of Utah.
After Steve Francis and Baron Davis, Miller would be the 3rd point guard off the board, going to a Cavs team led by a declining Shawn Kemp and featuring other solid talent like Lamont Murray and Wesley Person. But Miller would have to earn his playing time, as the Cavs already featured the 3rd-year Brevin Knight as their starting point guard. But Knight would miss 17 games due to knee tendonitis and wasn't a full-time starter when he did play. So Miller got his opportunity and proved himself. He would appear in all 82 games and finish as one of 4 players on the team to average double figures, while also finishing second to Knight in assists, as overall Miller would hit double figures in 46 games and dish at least 10 assists in 11 games, while even recording a triple-double in a March 5th loss to Atlanta, when he had 28 points, 10 rebounds, and 12 assists. And with Knight struggling to play his usual minutes, Miller would actually get to start 36 games over the season and perform very well in those games, as Miller would be named first team All-Rookie and finish top 5 in Rookie of the Year voting. But the Cavs were declining and would only manage a 32-50 record this season, missing the playoffs, with Miller's rookie year seeing him average about 11 points, 6 assists, and a steal per game. Knight would undergo knee surgery over the offseason and would only play 6 games for the Cavs before being traded mid-season. And Kemp had been traded before the season to Portland, so the Cavs were in a clear rebuild. They would welcome big man Zydrunas Ilgauskas back after missing the entire 2000 season, but he would only appear in 24 games. And Miller had to approach the game a bit differently this season, as a score-first player for the Cavs, leading the team in shot attempts and scoring, while still leading the team in assists and now steals, as his 8 assists per game would be 6th in the league. Miller would play and start in all 82 games, turning in 72 contests in double figures, and his first career 30-point game, when he had 30 points and 10 assists in a loss to Charlotte. Additionally, he would record 24 games with at least 10 assists and 22 double-doubles. The Cavs would have a surprising 15-7 start to the season, but it all went downhill after that, as from late January to mid-February, they lost 10 straight and had 2 more 7-game losing skids after that, to finish the year at 30-52 and again miss the playoffs, as year 2 had seen Miller average about 16 points, 8 assists, and 1.5 steals per game. Yet although Cleveland wasn't going to be at the top of the league anytime soon, the same couldn't be said for Miller. Prior to the season, the Cavs hired a new head coach in John Lucas and acquired a high-flying swingman in Ricky Davis, as his jumping, with Miller's passing, made for some exciting highlights this year. Miller wouldn't be the team's leading scorer this season, but he was a close second on improved scoring, while again leading the team in steals. Unsurprisingly, he would also lead the team in assists, as this would be his first and only season averaging over 10 per game. But he wouldn't just lead the team, he would lead the NBA, with 10.9 assists per game over the 81 games he played. Miller would hit double figures in 67 games, including 6 games with at least 30, while also recording 49 games with at least 10 assists, 40 double-doubles, and 3 triple-doubles. And he would have a career game in a December 15th loss to Philly, when he would dish a career-high 22 assists, with 8 coming in the first quarter, along with 14 points. And on the defensive end, he would record a career-high 9 steals, with 5 coming in the fourth quarter. The Cavs had seen their offense improve, but they struggled to stop anybody, finishing with a bottom 5 defense, as this season would see Cleveland drop 12 in a row and fail to win 30 games, finishing at 29-53 and missing the playoffs, as Miller's season had seen him average about 16.5 points, 11 assists, and 1.5 steals per game. But when the 03 season started, Miller would be much closer to home. Miller was entering a contract year and coming off a season which saw him lead the league in assists, so he wanted a max deal worth about $80 million, which Cleveland wasn't willing to pay. So on July 30th, he would be sent to the Los Angeles Clippers for Darius Miles. And Miller would also say on the Knuckleheads podcast,
I mean, basically, the organization told me, they was going to tank the season so they could get LeBron. So my agent was like, you know how the agents are like, Andre, you might as well ask for a trade.
So he and Miller would request the trade. And now Miller was joining a young, exciting Clippers team featuring big man Elton Brand and the versatile Lamar Odom, as well as great wing players in Quentin Richardson and Corey Maggette. Unfortunately, these players would rarely be on the court together, as they would each miss at least 18 games. But Miller was his usual model of consistency, playing and starting in 80 games, yet seeing his numbers drop across the board, turning in some of his lowest numbers since his rookie year, yet he would still lead the Clippers in assists. Miller would hit double figures in 58 games, yet record just 11 double-doubles, but would still manage 1 triple-double. Prior to the season, the Clippers were one of the most hyped teams in the league, but they would get nowhere close to living up to that, finishing with the second worst record in the West at 27-55 and missing the playoffs, as Miller's contract year had seen him average about 13.5 points, 6.5 rebounds, and a steal per game. But now, Miller was a free agent coming off a down year. On the first day of free agency, Miller was signed to an offer sheet by the Denver Nuggets for about $50 million over 6 years. And although the Clippers had a chance to match it, they would decline, as Miller was joining a Denver team coming off a 17-65 season, but who had also just selected Carmelo Anthony in the NBA draft. Anthony would steal the show as a rookie, and would continue to do so for years. They featured an often injured Marcus Camby, but he would be relatively healthy throughout his time in Denver, and would anchor the Nuggets' defense. Additionally, they had solid starters in Nene and Shawn Leonard, and a pint-sized scorer off the bench in Earl Boykins. And Miller played his role as a floor general perfectly. His first year in Denver would see him shoot a then career-high 45.7%, while still being the team's second leading scorer and leading the team in assists and steals. He would play and start in all 82 games, hitting double figures in 67 of them, and recording 10 double-doubles with 1 triple-double. And finally, Miller was on a competitive team, as the Nuggets were one of the league's highest scoring teams, playing at its fastest pace, and would greatly improve on last season, finishing with a 43-39 record, which secured them the West's final playoff spot and Miller's first postseason appearance of his career. Denver would be outmatched by a Minnesota team featuring league MVP Kevin Garnett, but Miller came to play. He would have an efficient 12 points in a Game 1 loss, followed by 12 points and 2 steals as the Nuggets fell behind 0-2. Back in Denver, the Nuggets would blow out the Wolves in Game 3, as Miller finished with 19, 7, and 6, but then lost a close one in Game 4, as Miller had just 13 points on 6 of 16 shooting. Miller would have 21 points on nearly 59% shooting with 3 steals in Game 5, but it wasn't enough, as the Wolves wrapped up the series, with Miller's first season in Denver seeing him average about 15 points, 6 assists, and 1.5 steals per game. Denver made a huge offseason splash when they acquired Kenyon Martin from the New Jersey Nets, as it looked like there would be a lot of lobs in Denver for years to come. Miller was even better for the Nuggets in 05, finishing as the team's 3rd leading scorer on further improved shooting, while again leading the team in steals and assists, as his 6.9 assists would be a top 10 mark in the league. Miller would hit double figures in 51 games and record 13 double-doubles, but Nene and Leonard would miss significant time this season, and the Nuggets were heading backwards quickly. Over the first 42 games of the year, they would go through 2 coaches and were sitting at 17 and 25, but then Denver's front office brought in George Karl, and under him, the Nuggets would become the league's hottest team, going 32 and 8 in their final 40 games to improve on last season with a 49 and 33 record and make a return to the playoffs, as this time they would take on San Antonio. Miller came out on a tear, as he would lead all scorers with a postseason career-high 31 points in a Game 1 win. Over the rest of the series, he would average about 5 assists per game, yet would only score more than 12 points once, while shooting about 40% and fouling out of games 4 and 5, as the Nuggets would lose in a gentleman's sweep, with Miller's season seeing him average about 13.5 points, 7 assists, and 1.5 steals per game. Injuries would again hold the Nuggets back in 06, as on top of Camby and Martin each missing 26 games, Nene would only appear briefly in 1 game, so the Nuggets were extremely thin in the front court, and their defense would suffer because of it. Yet again, Miller was in the starting lineup for every game and put up his usual numbers as the team's 2nd leading scorer and top distributor, and his 8.2 assists per game was his highest mark since he led the league in 02, as he would finish 6th in the NBA in assists, and would have at least 10 assists in 27 games this season. Although the Nuggets were often short-handed and missing some of their best scoring options, their fast-paced offense would still see them as one of the league's highest scoring teams, and they would still manage a winning record at 44 and 38, as they would win the division and get the 3 seed in the West and a playoff matchup with Miller's former team in the Los Angeles Clippers. Miller would lead all players in assists and was 2nd on the Nuggets in scoring. He came out hot again in Game 1 with 25 points and 6 assists in a loss. He would then have 14, 6, and 6 in a Game 2 loss, but the Nuggets would get a win in Game 3, as Miller had 14 points and 7 assists. Then even though Miller averaged 14.5 points, 8.5 assists, and 2 steals over Games 4 and 5, the Nuggets would drop both, as they would again get bounced in the first round, with Miller's season seeing him average about 13.5 points, 8 assists, and 1.5 steals per game. The Nuggets had the same core in 07, but had added J.R. Smith via an offseason trade. Carmelo Anthony in year 4 was having a great season, residing near the top of the league's scoring leaderboards, and this was leading to a lot of Miller assists, as in his first 23 games with Denver, he was averaging over 9 dimes per game. But after a 14-9 start, Denver decided they needed to make some sort of change that could help them finally get out of the first round. Denver would decide they needed to get as much scoring as possible, so on December 19th, they would orchestrate a trade with Philadelphia to acquire Sixers star Allen Iverson, with the main piece sent to Philly being Andre Miller. Miller would express on the Knuckleheads podcast that he was originally upset that he was leaving a winning situation for a young, struggling Sixers team, but he soon realized that just because it was a different situation didn't mean it was a worse situation, and he had to figure out how to help the team in a different way. So when acquiring Miller, the Sixers were getting a veteran point guard who at the time was top 3 in the league in assists per game. Philly was a young team with their top players being 3rd-year swingman Andre Iguodala and 4th-year sharpshooter Kyle Korver. Upon arrival, Miller would see his assist numbers drop, but this was more of a result from going from one of the league's highest scoring teams in Denver to one of its lowest scoring in Philly, who played at a much slower pace. So Miller's 7.3 assists per game in his 57 games as a Sixer in 07 was still very impressive, and overall Miller would finish as a top 10 distributor in the league for the 3rd straight season. However, the Sixers were 5-18 at the time of the trade, and would only manage a 35-47 record while missing the playoffs, as Miller's overall season had seen him average about 13.5 points, 8 assists, and 1.5 steals per game. But now in Philly, Miller would again be relied on for improved scoring, and he would deliver. The Sixers added a solid rookie through the draft in Thaddeus Young, but Korver was limited to just 25 games. Yet Miller, Iguodala, and big man Samuel D'Alembert would help the Sixers become one of the league's top defensive teams. And although they were one of the lower scoring offenses, Miller had the best scoring season of his career, finishing second on the team with a career-high 17 points per game on a career-high 49.2% shooting, while still leading the team with nearly 7 assists per game. Overall, Miller would record double figures in 71 games, while dropping at least 20 in 31 of those, and would still record 14 double-doubles. Expectations for Philly prior to the season were low, and the predictions seemed right, as about halfway through the year, the Sixers were 16-28, but soon after, they would rattle off a 5-game win streak, and over their final 38 games of the season, would go 24-14. And although a 40-42 record isn't great, it was enough for a playoff berth against the second-seed Detroit Pistons. A veteran Pistons team would expectedly win the series, but the Sixers were able to push them to 6 games, with Miller leading the charge for Philly, as he was the team's top scorer in the series. But the tough Pistons defense would contribute to his assist numbers plummeting to only about 3 per game. Miller would go for 20 points in Game 1 as Philly took the win. Then after a Game 2 loss, Miller would go for 21 points as the Sixers jumped out to a 2-1 lead. But after this, Detroit would lock in, as Miller would dish a total of 7 assists over the next 3 games and shoot a combined 9 for 33 across Games 5 and 6, with Detroit winning 3 straight to take the series, as Miller's first full season in Philly would see him average about 17 points, 7 assists, and 1.5 steals per game. Philly made one of the offseason's biggest acquisitions by signing Elton Brand, but unfortunately, injuries would limit him to just 29 games in 09. Young would take a big step forward in year 2, and Miller would again have a great scoring season. His points and shooting percentage dropped slightly, but he still acted as the team's second leading scorer on good efficiency, while yet again pacing the team in the assist department, as overall he would hit double figures in 68 games with 10 double-doubles and 2 triple-doubles. But the Sixers looked like a different team than the one who had ended last season, as they would stumble out to a 9-14 start before head coach Mo Cheeks was sent packing. They would bring in Tony DeLeo, and the team would show improvement, going 32-27 under the new coach to finish with a 41-41 record. And once again, this was enough for a playoff berth and a first-round matchup with Orlando. Miller would have the greatest playoff series of his career, as he would average over 21 points, 6 rebounds, and 5 assists for the series. He had 15, 7, and 7 in a Game 1 win. Then even though he had 30 points on 60% shooting in Game 2, the Magic evened the series. Miller came back with 24 in a Game 3 win. Then although he would have 17 points in both Games 4 and 5, while averaging 5 assists and 2 steals, the Sixers dropped both. Then even though Miller went for 24, 7, and 5 on nearly 54% shooting in Game 6, the Magic won easily, as once again Miller failed to get out of the first round. But his regular season had seen him average about 16.5 points, 6.5 assists, and 1.5 steals per game. But Miller's contract was up, and yet again, he would not be re-signed by his current team. Miller was offered a deal from the Sixers, but it was only for a year at the mid-level exception. And even though Miller was getting older, as he was set to turn 34 this upcoming season, he was still effective, so he would decline their offer and test free agency. And he would soon get connected with the Portland Trail Blazers, and would in turn do everything he could to convince them to sign him, putting in serious preparation before meeting with the team. And even though Portland wanted to make offers to guys like Hedo Turkoglu and Paul Millsap, Miller was okay with waiting and being the Blazers' fallback plan. And when Portland struck out twice, they went back to Miller, who graciously accepted a 3-year deal worth $22 million. Miller joined what looked like an up-and-coming Blazers team with Brandon Roy, LaMarcus Aldridge, and Greg Oden. But Oden's career never got off the ground due to injuries, as he would only appear in 21 games this season. And knee issues would begin to spell the end for Roy, as he would miss 17 games of his own this season. Miller once again would appear in all 82 games, but for the first time since his rookie year, he would come off the bench multiple times in one season. And with less time on the court, he saw his numbers take a bit of a hit. But the Blazers were still a good team and featured one of the league's best defenses. And after 48 games, they were sitting at a respectable 27-21, entering a January 30th matchup with Dallas, where Miller would unexpectedly erupt. Miller was less than 2 months from his 34th birthday and had yet to crack the 40-point mark in a game throughout his 11-year career. However, with Roy sitting out this game, the Blazers needed offense, and Miller came out aggressive, taking 8 shots in the first quarter and scoring 8 points. Then in the second quarter, he added 11 more. He would have another 8 in the third quarter, as he had an impressive 27 points entering the fourth, but then he went unconscious, as he went 7 of 8 from the field and 4 for 4 from the free throw line, en route to 18 fourth quarter points. And with the game needing overtime to be decided, Miller led all scorers in the extra period with 7 more points, as the Blazers won by 2, and Miller ended the game with a career-high 52 points. The Blazers would win 22 more games after this to finish the season with a 50-32 record, and would get a first-round playoff matchup with Phoenix. As had become customary, Miller came out strong in Game 1 with 31 points and 8 assists in a win. The next 4 games would see him average about 15 points and 6 assists, yet he would only shoot about 39%, as the Blazers were down 3-2. Then in a do-or-die Game 6, Miller had just 4 points on 2 of 10 shooting, as Phoenix won the game and the series, with Miller's first year in Portland seeing him average about 14 points, 5.5 assists, and a steal per game. Miller was back to a full-time starter in 2011, but now Roy would appear in just 47 games, with Odom missing the entire season. Miller's scoring again dropped, but he upped his assists to 7 a game, and even with the injuries, Portland had a great defense which helped them remain competitive, and they could always rely on Miller to be available. But then in a December 5th win versus the Clippers, Miller shoved Blake Griffin hard. Originally, nothing was called, but upon league review, Miller was issued a 1-game suspension, missing the Blazers' next game versus Phoenix, which marked the end of Miller's streak of 632 consecutive games, dating back to the 03 season. But he still started 81 games and helped the Blazers to a 48-34 record and a first-round matchup with Dallas. Miller played an incredible series, as over the first 5 games, he averaged about 17 points and 6 assists on nearly 52% shooting. The Blazers would fall behind 0-2 after dropping the first 2 games in Dallas, but they got the job done in Portland, winning the next 2 at home to even the series. They would lose Game 5 in Dallas, and then in Game 6, they weren't able to again defend home court, as Miller had his worst game, with 5 points on 2 of 7 shooting in a loss that ended Portland's year, with Miller's season seeing him average about 12.5 points, 7 assists, and 1.5 steals per game. But during the offseason, Miller would be shipped away, yet he would go to a familiar place. Miller was included in a 3-team deal, which saw him end up back in Denver. The Nuggets now looked much different and much younger. They were still coached by Carl, but had a new point guard as their focal point in Ty Lawson, meaning for the first time since his rookie season, Miller would be primarily a backup, yet would do well in this role while also acting as a veteran presence. Miller would average less than 10 points per game for the first time in his career, but his 6.7 assists per game would still lead the team, as he would become one of the league's top 6 men in the lockout-shortened 2012 season. Although Miller started just 7 games, he appeared in all 66, for a Nuggets team who scored the most points in the league, yet allowed the second most points as well. But they made it work, as they finished at 38-28 and got a first-round matchup with the Lakers. But at this point, it just seemed like Miller was never meant to make it out of the first round. A 36-year-old Miller would again have a great series, as he would average about 11 points, 5 rebounds, and 6 assists off the bench, and would even have a 24-point, 8-assist performance in a Game 5 win. But even though he had 11 rebounds and 8 assists in Game 7, the Lakers came out on top, as Miller's season had seen him average about 9.5 points, 6.5 assists, and a steal per game. 2013 saw the Nuggets acquire Andre Iguodala from Philly, reuniting him with Miller. And Denver would also get a great season from the second-year Kenneth Faried. The Nuggets would surprise a lot of people this year, as while still boasting the league's highest scoring offense, the addition of Iguodala and great play from Faried would help them improve on the defensive side of the ball. Miller was again the team's 6th man, putting up similar numbers to last year on improved shooting efficiency, even finishing top 10 in 6th man of the year voting. And the Nuggets looked like a good team, sitting at 25-18 about halfway through the season. But then they would go 33-7 the rest of the way, which included a 15-game win streak, as their 57-25 record would get them the 3 seed in the West and a first-round matchup with a Golden State Warriors team led by a young Steph Curry. And Miller would make his mark early. Game 1 would see Miller come out to score a game-high 28 points on 11 of 16 shooting, which included the game-winning layup, to give the Nuggets a 1-0 lead. He would have 18 the following game, but the Warriors would even the series. But Miller would struggle the rest of the way, as he would average less than 10 points and never again shoot over 40%, while only averaging about 3 assists, as the Warriors would win 3 out of the next 4 to take the series in 6 games, with Miller's season seeing him average about 9.5 points, 6 assists, and a steal per game. Going into 2014, Denver looked a lot different. Iguodala had left to sign with Golden State, and Carl had been let go shortly after last season ended, as he was replaced with Brian Shaw. But under Shaw, Miller would be an afterthought, as over the first 30 games of the season, he was only getting about 19 minutes per game and putting up career low numbers, and the normally cool-headed Miller would finally reach his boiling point in January. Near the end of a January 1st loss to Philly, Miller would uncharacteristically blow up on Shaw on the sidelines, as he was frustrated that he had not played even though he was healthy, marking the first DNP of Miller's now 15-year career. This would eventually lead to the Nuggets suspending Miller for 2 games, and even though they rescinded the suspension days later, Miller would never again suit up for the Nuggets, as he would sit out the next 21 games before being sent to Washington at the deadline. In Washington, Miller would see even less minutes, but was more valuable in what he could do to help the Warriors' young guard duo of John Wall and Bradley Beal. Miller joined a 26-28 Wizards team who turned it on after acquiring him, going 18-10 to finish at 44-38 and get a first-round matchup with Chicago. Miller appeared in every game this series and averaged 9 points over the first 2 games, as Washington won both. He would have a much smaller role the remainder of the series, but the Wizards would win in 5, as Miller had finally made it out of the first round. Next was the Pacers, and while Miller gave the Wizards solid minutes, he didn't make a huge impact in what would be a 5-game series loss for Washington, as Miller's overall season had seen him average about 5 points, 3.5 assists, and half a steal per game. Miller began the 2015 season as a Wizard, yet was an even smaller part of the rotation. However, he would still appear in 51 of the team's first 54 games. But with the Wizards looking to get a younger and more athletic point guard to back up Wall, they would elect to send Miller to Sacramento around the trade deadline for Ramon Sessions. Miller would join a Kings team led by DeMarcus Cousins and Rudy Gay, and would play meaningful minutes with the Kings recently losing point guard Darren Collison. But the Kings were just 18-34 at the time of the trade, and a soon-to-be 39-year-old Miller wasn't going to save their season. But he would appear in each of their 30 remaining games, as they would go 11-19 the rest of the way to finish at 29-53 and miss the playoffs, as Miller's overall year had seen him average about 4.5 points, 3.5 assists, and half a steal per game. A free agent Miller would sign with the Timberwolves prior to the 2016 season, but Miller was almost 40 years old, and the Wolves were a young team who weren't going to be competing for a title anytime soon. So after appearing in 26 games, Miller and the Wolves agreed on a buyout in late February so that Miller could sign on with a contender. Days later, Miller would sign with the San Antonio Spurs team boasting a 50-9 record, and he would contribute, as he would appear in 13 of their final 23 games and even start 4 of them, as the Spurs would finish with a 67-15 record and get a first-round matchup with Memphis. San Antonio would make quick work of the Grizzlies in a dominant 4-game sweep, with Miller seeing the court in 2 games and making minimal contributions. The second round brought Oklahoma City, but after the Spurs went up 2-1, they would drop 3 straight to lose the series, as Miller again played sparingly, appearing in 3 total games as his best chance to win a title ended. But his overall season had seen him average about 3.5 points, 2 assists, and half a steal per game. But that would mark the end of the line for the 40-year-old Miller, as after 17 years, he called it a career, retiring with over 16,000 points, 8,000 assists, and 1,500 steals. And as of 2024, is the only player with those career totals to never make an All-Star game. And after his playing career, Miller would make an unsurprising transition to a career in coaching. Andre Miller is one of the most consistent point guards to ever play the game. No matter what was going on with your team, you knew that Miller would be ready to go every night. He was much more athletic than he let on, but a big reason for his career lasting as long as it did was due to him rarely using his athleticism. He was patient and precise, but knew when to kick it into high gear and push the ball. His scoring came from within the 3-point line, but he could give it to you in so many ways. Yet you didn't worry about his scoring as much as you worried about him picking you apart with his passing. From his earliest years in college to his final years in the NBA, Andre Miller was a complete point guard. And as the league evolved, Miller became a throwback, one of the last of a dying breed of quote-unquote pure point guards. His career lacks the playoff success that would have likely helped his legacy, but nearly every team he played for went to the postseason. And even though he was often undervalued and underappreciated by the front offices he played for, he took everything in stride with a smile on his face. And no matter what, Andre Miller was always going to show up for his teammates and the fans. But that's it for today's episode on Andre Miller. Hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. If you liked it, check out this one on one of his college teammates, or this one on a player he teamed briefly with in Cleveland. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.